Welcome back to the Glass Studio, friends. My name is Davin and I'm a glass blower. So what I had planned today was to do another episode of mixing glass blowing and cocktails. And I was going to do the margarita. It was going to be a lot of fun. We were going to talk about how a margarita is really just a coupe glass and there's no such thing as a margarita glass, which is really interesting because there's no such thing as a coupe glass that was based off of Marie Antoinette's breasts. And it was going to be this whole thing about like the apocryphal stories that kind of come about around these objects that have some importance in our lives, or at least in popular culture and kind of folklore. But I'm not feeling it. This glass comes out pretty good. I do enjoy it. I just don't feel like drinking a margarita out of it, and that's part of the whole glass blowing and cocktails thing, is I mix my own version of whatever that cocktail is and talk about its history too. So we're gonna have to save that for another time. So instead, what I think we're gonna do today is talk about an introduction to the kind of traditional Italian process of putting together a piece of stemware. A lot of glass blowers call these goblets. They'll say things like, yeah, that person's a really good goblet maker. Even though if someone's a cup maker, they probably 99% of the things they make are not goblets. Like a goblet is a very specific shape of glass. Never mind. It's just what we call them. A lot of people affectionately just call them cups, whatever. Stemware. So, what sets Italian stemware apart from more European, Swedish and Scandinavian style, or the typical drinkware that you would find in a catalog of wine glasses or something like a Riedel? The difference is that these are put together in sections. Oftentimes, the bowl, the top that I'm working on right now is done, and then the stem and foot combination, or sometimes a stem separate from a foot, are all built and then put together hot, rather than having something that is built entirely together. It's built in sections and then those are assembled, I guess is a better way of saying it. So even though this isn't an Italian shaped vessel, what I'm doing right now is working in the tradition that Italians have been working in, making these kinds of forms for, I don't know, hundreds of years. I mean, we're talking 16th, 17th century. We have examples of this type of glass working process. And it involves assistance. A lot of the objects I've made on this channel up till now, I've made solo or can easily be made solo. You could make this solo, but it'd be much more difficult. So I just had my partner, my assistant, bring me a bit of glass, and we're starting a thing called an Avolio, which is this wonderfully elegant connection element. It's an element that goes as a transition between components. Often you'll see Avolios used between the bowl and the stem, and sometimes even between the stem and the foot, as this way of it almost sort of causes the object to want to seem to float more. But it's also a really genius connecting element, and you'll see that later on when we build this thing, we put it all together. So I'm making a two-part Avolio. The way I like to think about this as a glass blower is I am making two discs and I'm pulling a piece of cane between those two discs, and it makes this incredibly strong shape. If you notice, it's the same shape as my neckline. This kind of swoopy hourglass shape viewed side on like this is like two arches sort of facing each other, right? And what it does is it creates this incredibly strong shape that won't break. Even though it's delicate looking, it won't break unless you want it to. So you'll see here that I'm going to use my tweezers, which are cold, grab the neckline, put tiny micro fractures in it, and it will cause it to break away free and straight. Now, I'm going to touch the Avolio. I don't want it to crack. So what I'm doing is I'm using the hot glass that is up on my blowpipe. It's about 1,000 degrees, preheating the tips of these tweezers so that now I can go ahead and touch this Avolio, straighten it on that punty, and not have to worry about it cracking. So from here, it's just glass blowing as usual. I'm tweezering and trimming the rim. Usually I tweezer it a lot more than people think you would. I want to really thin that glass out. If you tweezer and then trim immediately, you don't have to have somebody protect your object from that trimming coming back and touching. There's something about the process of tweezering and immediately trimming that keeps that from happening. Now I'm going to use the Soffietta, like we talked about in our last episode, and I'm going to use it to thin out and reshape, basically make this bowl wider. That's going to set up the top of this for me to use the parchofis, which are those wooden jacks that I just took out. What makes them so wonderful is that because they've been soaked in water, as soon as that water touches this really hot glass, it turns into water vapor, steam. It makes a layer of steam that is between the wooden blades and the glass, and it causes it to turn super smooth. It prevents marks on the surface as well, or at least reduces marks. So you get less sort of scratch lines on the surface, although I'll be honest, I don't really mind them. But the parchofis are a standard tool used in making bowls. So now my partner brings over a preheated paddle and we break the object free of the punty. They're going to take the bowl of the Margarita glass and put it in a preheated furnace called a garage, which is sitting at around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it can sit there sort of indefinitely while we build the rest of our stemware. We're going to start with the stem, and I'm going to make a fairly traditional shaped stem. The Italian name for this is gambo, which just means stem, and I think Dante Marioni actually made a whole series of vases based on this shape. Traditional Italian blown stems are made in this sort of very particular shape, and I'm making a kind of exaggerated version of that. Almost every cup maker I know, you can kind of recognize them from their stem in their cup, or goblet, whatever you want to call it. It's almost like a signature in a way. So, for example, Mongrain's, James Mongrain's stems are very thin, very elegant, much narrower than a lot of other people's stems. When I say stem, I'm talking specifically about this shape stem. Dante Marioni's are closer to this shape. They're a little bit more robust, more curvy, more round. Lino Telly Pietra's stems were also more full, more round. They had they don't come as quickly to a waist as these do. If you're surprised to learn that Lino Telly Pietra, who is sort of like the great granddaddy of American studio glass blowing, in the sense that he brought over a lot of the Italian tradition to America through Pilchuck. If you're surprised to know that he was a stemware maker, then you should go and watch the documentary on Lino. He was one of the premier stemware makers in Murano before he retired, and started his new career as a glass artist in America. If you ever seen any of his goblet making videos, which there's a few out there floating around on the internet, they're amazing. He just does it casually and offhandedly, but he too has a sort of a signature stem look. This is just sort of where I'm at right now. I like this shape. I like the exaggerated flair of it and how I can have it flow directly into the foot. Speaking of which, my partner in the background is doing one of the hardest tasks in glass blowing, I think, which is to make a nice, thin, well-heated, watch their hands right now. Watch this back and forth move, and then whoop, out. The smoothness of that move is so incredibly difficult. Which is one of the reasons why it's difficult to make cups like this, to make goblets like this. You need skilled assistants to bring these things to you, because I can make that foot and give it to somebody, but they still have to be able to pull that move off. So, doing feet, that's way bigger than normal, but I want to make it thin. One of the things you'll see I'm doing is I'm pulling toward me, and I'm going to squeeze this. That's going to puff that up. That's what I'm doing. What I just did there is change the shape of the bubble that is attached to this stem, and that's going to sort of be like a prelim shape for opening this foot. So as you're probably gathering, if you're new to glass blowing, a lot of Italian styled vessels, stemware, were made out of multiple bubbles. And that's what sets them apart from, your typical stemware that you might get in a restaurant. The stems and feet on those objects are typically solid. So that's one of the elements that sets this apart from your typical stemware, or that kind of stemware where you're using a footing tool and you're spinning a foot. I love those. I use that tool all the time. But this is a very sort of different kind of methodology for creating these objects. This is a very simplified version of Italian cup making, by the way. I'm not adding a lot of bits, a lot of frou-frou. I am really interested in this kind of pure form, this very curvy form that kind of flows out of the ground up into the stem, and then will flow naturally through the Avolio into the bowl. Punting goblets, by the way, super delicate. And you'll see here in a second how incredibly delicate these punties are, because this one is going to come off, I think right about here, right there. Before I can break the stem free, the punny breaks off of the foot. That shows how delicate it was. And it was entirely my fault. The punty that my partner made, my assistant made, was very well done. But if you rewind a little bit, you'll see that the blowpipe had no heat in it. It had no color. See, there's a dull red right now. Because it had no red in it earlier on, that meant that the glass up near that blowpipe was far too cold to want to break easily. One of the kind of principles that's hard to wrap your mind around with glass blowing is that at a certain point, if the glass is too cold, it hardens, it self-tempers. You want the glass to be warm and weak. If it's warm, then when I touch it with my cold tweezers, I'll create micro fractures in that neckline that'll cause it to break free, just like that, from the rest of it. If it's too cold, my cold tools don't create those micro fractures. So now we have a stem and foot component, and we need to prep them so that we can add the bowl that we've already made. That my partner right now is preheating that bowl in the hot part of the garage. I'm going to cheat a little bit and use the torch to help prep the top of that stem to make the right shape to connect it to the bowl, which means opening it a little bit, changing the shape a little bit. If I didn't have a torch, I would just use the reheating furnace, the glory hole, to do this. But since I have a torch, I get to cheat a little bit. If this was back in the day and I didn't have a torch, I would also need a third person to bring me a tiny little glue bit of glass that I would attach to the top of the stem, and that would act like a little sticky glue thing. to stick the bowl on. But I don't have to do that because I have a torch, so I can use it. I can use it to preheat my tweezers. My partner is going to bring over the bowl from the garage. I use my preheated tweezers to pick it up, try to touch it on center, get a couple of moves there to make sure that it's centered and straight. Then I go back into the reheating furnace for a nice long flash to homogenize the heat. Make sure everything is stuck together really nicely. Come out, make sure it's centered. I usually believe if it's centered, break it off right away. There's no need to monkey about with it. It's more likely it's going to break off the punny. Punny comes clean. You put it away with forks so that it hangs vertically. That keeps you from bending it with the gloves. And that's it. Until next time that we get some hot glass together. Cheers.